All right, so this breakout session, we're going to be talking about the issue of creation, and I want to relate creation to, and again, I don't have a way to tell the time because I have my phone over there. I don't know what to do without my phone. Can somebody give me something to use? We don't have a clock in the sanctuary, which makes it a little difficult. Thank you. I just don't want to go too long because I can easily go forever. I can just keep talking. So I want to talk about creation in relation to some of the issues that we talked about, and I want to talk particularly about the relationship between creation and redemption. I want this to be largely discussion, so because it is a breakout session, I don't want it to just be a lecture, so I'd like you guys to just... You got me playing.
I'm just seeing
it's working, okay. But if you have questions, comments, just raise your hand. And, whenever, interrupt if you feel like it, because I want to have as much interaction as possible. Because this is a little bit more chance for interaction than we have in lectures. That's kind of the point of a breakout session.
Pastor, I'm left with a question from yesterday related to creation.
Yeah, you can ask a question from yesterday, that's fine.
At one point, it was said that grace wasn't necessary before the fall. But I sometimes look at creation as God created grace in the creation.
That wasn't... Yes, I did talk about the relationship between grace and creation, and that's an important point.
Okay.
I did not say that there is no grace before the fall. But I said that in the Escondido school of thought, there is no grace before the fall, from their perspective. So the idea there is that grace is redefined. Grace, what's the typical definition of grace?
Unmerited favor.
Yeah, unmerited favor. Right? That's how we always define grace, pretty much. There's been a redefinition of the term grace to mean demerited favor, which is something different. So it's not just God's kindness. It's not just that we don't merit anything that God gives us grace, but we actually merit the opposite. So in that scenario, you can't have grace apart from the fall. Without sin, there's no such thing as grace. That is not in the historic Protestant tradition at all. And by Protestant, I'm using the broadest term, including Lutheran and Reformed. In both of those traditions, historically, the language of grace has been used to refer to the state before the fall. But some contemporary theologians in the Reformed tradition have argued otherwise. And they've kind of redefined exactly what grace means. One of the ways that we can know this isn't the case in the Lutheran tradition is if you look at the discussions of the two natures of Christ and the communication of attributes between the human and divine natures. When we're speaking of the communication of the divine attributes to the human nature, they often use the term that it is a communication of grace. Now, did Christ do anything to demerit God's favor? No. So when we're using the term grace, we have used it in a broader sense. So unmerited favor. Now, obviously, grace, when you have sin in the picture, takes on a whole different form. I mean, grace is so much greater when you have sin in the picture, but that doesn't negate the utilization of the term grace in creation at all. Where in the catechism, the small catechism, does Luther bring up the language of, salvation, essentially, without merit or works? You know what section he brings that up in? One of the articles of the Creed?
First article.
It's in the first article. It's a language of, he created us apart from any merit or worthiness, on our part. We expect that to be in the second article on redemption. But Luther has this theology of creation that is very much tied to grace. And I think that's one of the important points as we're talking about Luther's view of creation, is that Luther ties creation to grace. One of the things that you're going to see in the Escondido school of thought is you have this radical divide between redemption and then preservation. Creation and preservation in one category, and then salvation in a totally separate category. Now, we need to distinguish those things, definitely. They're not exactly the same, but we can't divorce them because we're talking about grace when we're talking about creation itself. And so there is a tie with salvation, redemption, and creation that we have that's there from the very beginning. Because we're essentially using justification language to talk about creation. The language of, by God's grace, apart from merit or worthiness, the kind of language that Lutheran theologians have used growing out of the small catechism, it's salvation, justification language that's tied to creation. So we see creation itself as an act of grace. And the Reformed tradition largely does too in some sense, but there's debate on that point. So this would be a difference between the Escondido school of thought then and some of the other schools of thought within the broader Reformed tradition. Okay, so any other questions as we get started with this topic? You can ask questions at any point on anything relating to the topic. So we begin the Bible with an act of creation. God creates man. He creates through his word that is spoken. All things are created, but God has this special creation of man. He picks man up out of the dust and breathes life into him. And we see here that there is this essential tie that man has to the ground. We come from the ground. We are made from the ground. We have this tie to the land. And so when we're talking about creation, creation is the place where we were created to be. And that doesn't just mean creation is the place where we are created to be for now and then we will escape from it one day. We are created for the land, and one day we will come back to the land. And that theme of land shows up all throughout Scripture. This theme of we are made here, we are made for a very particular purpose.
Is that why it's such a heavy curse when Cain is cursed from the ground when he sins?
Yes, there is this language of the curse relating to man's place in the land. Yes, you're right, there's the curse cries out from the ground. That is upon Cain. And we see that there's this tie between the land that man was created in and then getting kicked out of that particular land. So the relationship between man and creation has been ruptured at that point. We have to go back to this what's called the cultural mandate or the creation mandate, which shows up in Genesis 1:26 and then 28, which says this: God said, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." And then in verse 28, God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea, and the birds of the air, and every other living thing that moves on the earth." So man is created in the context of creation, and then God gives this mandate. Now, the typical term that's used to describe this in the Reformed tradition is the cultural mandate. I would prefer to call this the vocational mandate, or the vocation mandate. That's more in line with the terminology that we usually use. So I would say this is the vocation mandate. This is the vocation that God gives to Adam and Eve. They are created with vocation in mind. They are given a vocation. This shows that vocation is not something that is a result of the fall, but it's just part of man's nature. We are created to work. We are created to have a vocation, and that vocation is tied to the land that we are created on. And it's tied to our relationship to the land, the animals, and one another. And culture develops out of this. So culture really is a creation of vocation. Vocation comes first, and culture is what grows out of our vocations. So vocation, I think, this is why I prefer to call it the vocation mandate, because I think vocation has the primacy, and culture then extends out of that, because culture really is a development of our vocation on the earth as well as our family, our vocation in the family. Culture grows out of that. And as we think about the aspects of culture, what are we thinking about? We're thinking about vocation, because we're thinking about culture, we're thinking about maybe the arts or the government or jobs, or these things all come out in the context, particularly of vocation. Okay, so we have man that's created, and God creates this very specific structure. Okay, God creates everything in a very particular order, and this goes along with the idea of stations, right? We all have these various stations in life, and God has created everything to have its unique station. And so we have kind of a hierarchy in creation that starts here. We've got God. God is the king who's ruling over all things. He shows up as the creator. He's creating the land, the animals, and the people. And God creates man and woman in his image. But we have man who has kind of the ruling, and man and woman both have a ruling authority in some sense, but man has the ruling authority. He is the one to rule under God. We have this language of him taking dominion over the earth. And then we have woman, who is certainly not less than man or less in the image of God in the imago Dei than man, but she has a specific function in creation, which is that she serves him in her own unique role under man. And then under woman, we have the animals. We also have the land. Okay? We have the animals. So we've got this structure. God creates everything with a particular structure. So we've got God, man, woman, and then we've got the animals, and then the animals really, in some sense, are over the land as well. God creates. There's kind of this pattern in creation that God creates this particular place, whether it's the sky or the water or the land, and then He creates the animals that are to fill and rule over those particular realms. So in some sense, we could even say that the animals rule over the land. Well, what do we see is happening in the fall? We see that this order is reversed. And we have who comes up to Eve and tempts her? An animal. Now, the animal is tempting her with what? Part of the land, okay, which is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The animal is misusing his role in the land, and so we have, in some sense, the tree being the root of what happens in sin here, which then is given to the animal, the serpent, who then goes to Eve and tempts her and takes a role that was Eve's over him. And then what does Eve do?
Gives it to man.
Gives it to man and takes the role of authority over man. And then what does man do? He essentially takes authority over God because he says, I'm going to not serve under God, but I'm going to have the knowledge of good and evil and rule in God's place. Because God said don't do it, and I'm going to do it anyway. So what we have is the reverse of the created order that's going on in the fall. So instead of going God down here to land, we have kind of the opposite, where everything is getting reversed. And so when we're talking about creation and creation's connection to vocation, then we have vocation being messed up. Our vocations are messed up. And this is really what we see in the event of the fall, is that we then take on roles that we are not called to and abuse our authority. And then when we look at the effects of sin, what are the curses related to? Vocation. They are related to the mandate, what I've called the vocational mandate. And so the curses are then related to this vocation mandate, to where man's cursed in his work on the ground. This was his vocation. This was his calling. He's going to serve the land. He's going to work the land, but he is cursed. Now there's thorns and thistles. And what happens to the woman? She's cursed in what? Childbearing, which is the other part of that mandate. And that part of the mandate has to do with having children and raising a family. And there is then a difficult relationship between man and wife. So we see these two primary areas then of vocation being messed up, which is work and family. Work and family are the two things that are directly affected by the fall. And so we see that the fall then has profound implications, not just for our relationship to God, but our relationship with one another and our various vocations and how we relate to creation.
Now extend that a bit, there was a curse on the animal too, but not on the land.
There was a curse on the animal, but there really is a curse on the land in some sense too. And we see in Romans 8, Paul uses the language of the land being in bondage too. Everything is affected by sin. So when man sins, all of creation is messed up. The order of everything is messed up. All of this is messed up. And that includes the land as well. So that also includes the creation.
I would see that the land that man tries to till is the hard part. But where man's not tilling the land, it still flourishes.
Yeah, and it's not that there's no flourishing land, but we have this theme in Scripture that connects different kinds of lands. Okay, and here's what I mean. Okay, man was created. What kind of land was man created in?
Garden.
A garden. Now, what do we see in the garden? We see plentiful plants. We see there's animals roaming around. There are rivers that are described. So we have a garden that this is the perfect land. This is the land without sin. This is the land that man was created to rule over. It's not difficult. It's plentiful. It's rich. Man has all the food he wants. God himself is walking in the garden in the midst of man. Perfect fellowship with God and perfect fellowship with other human beings, as well as perfect fellowship with creation itself. This is the proper ordering of things. When man sins, then, he's kicked out of the land. This tells us something, that man's relationship not only to God and his wife and his children, but even to the creation itself is messed up. So we see that man is kicked out of the land. This is the perfect land, the land where God's presence is. He's kicked out of that land, and then we see that there is an angel with a flaming sword guarding the land, saying, you cannot enter into this land right now. This perfect relationship that you have with God's creation, as well as God being present there, that's messed up. And we have this theme of the land then that extends throughout Scripture. I'm teaching a Bible study series at the congregation right now on the theme of land. We've been going through, we're still in Genesis, and we've been doing it for over a month now, 5 weeks I think. But there's so much to deal with this theme. But one of the things that you see in Scripture is there is this strong contrast. You have a contrast between the land that is garden, the land that is full of rivers, and the desert. There's an important distinction. There's a reason why the Israelites are captured in the desert, and they're wandering in the desert, because the desert serves as a picture of the brokenness of man's creational role on the land. Because what's the desert? It's dry, it's barren, there isn't water, and now God miraculously provides those things for the people. But the desert is not the kind of place that God created man for. He created us for richness. He created us for, the lush garden to be able to work. And so the desert then kind of serves as the symbol of what is messed up about our relationship to creation. So the vocation that we have in relation to creation is then messed up. Now I want to leave room for questions now before I move on. I want to just stop and see if there's any questions up until this point. Yeah, go ahead.
Creation of angels, is that involved in that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure. I mean, I guess in some sense you could say that man's relationship to the angels is messed up too, because who's the one guarding the garden is an angel. And you do have, the angels are there to serve man and to work in harmony with one another and in worship to God. But this relationship then is messed up too, because now they're, in a sense, the guardians of God's holiness. And so, you have the example in the book of Joshua where the angel says he's not for them or for the enemy. Whereas in the perfect creation, the angel would be on the same side as man. He's kind of taken on a different role. So you could say that as well. And you also have, again, dealing with the order here, we're told that we are going to judge the angels. So in some sense, we're created to be in a hierarchy even over the angels. And the demons are what? Fallen angels. So if Satan then is taking control over man, again, that's a reversal of the created order. Yes?
In connection with that angel sidetrack, Theodore of Mopsuestia, in his understanding of the fall, all creation groans. It's not just creation below man, but also creation above man, because it becomes onerous for the angels to serve man now. And he said, the angels, basically God placated the angels by showing them Christ. Here's a man that you can serve honestly and truly, and for the sake of him, continue to serve the human race also. But it could not have been nearly as pleasant for them as it was supposed to have been.
Wow, thank you for that. That's a really neat connection there that I hadn't really even thought about. The creation groaning would be the connection with all of creation. We think of physical creation, but that's a good insight. So we have man's relationship to God and creation messed up through the fall. And so I want to talk about how, as Christians now, this all relates to how we look at the land and how we look at the earth and how we look at culture in relation to these things. I think to understand this, we have to come to an understanding of something that Luther talks about in his treatise on Christian liberty, which I know Dr. V already kind of touched on here a little bit. And this is a fantastic treatise. If you haven't read it, you need to. It's really foundational for understanding Luther's thought, I think. And this treatise can be read in a wrong way, I think, and I'm going to explain why. Luther uses these strong contrasts, and he uses statements that might sound contradictory. His whole thesis is that we are both a servant of all and a servant of none at the same time. Well, what does that mean? How is that, how do these things make sense? It seemed to be contradictory. What Luther does is he distinguishes between two aspects of the human person. He talks about the soul and he talks about the body. Now, the way that we can misunderstand that, is that he's making this strong dichotomy to kind of say, well, the soul and the body are against one another, this kind of dualism. And he's sometimes been read that way, and I think that's very, very much a wrong reading of Luther. But we can have this reading that what really matters is the soul, because he's talking about salvation in relation to the soul. We're saying, well, salvation is the soul, the body's just this other thing that does this stuff that doesn't really matter. That's clearly not what Luther's saying. But he, essentially, the way that Luther phrases this is another way of speaking about what we've already talked about, which is the two kinds of righteousness. These are very much related themes. And even though the term two kinds of righteousness isn't used in Unchristian Liberty, that's really, if you read his sermon on two kinds of righteousness and the development of that theme in the Galatians commentary, he's really talking about the same thing. He's just using different terminology. So we have here, we have our passive righteousness and active righteousness. Okay, so this outline is one that, I use a lot. And Bierman uses this as well. He's the one who kind of came up with, I think, the basic diagram, but it's pretty simple. Essentially, we have, we've got 3 lines if we're going to be exact, but we've got passive righteousness, right, which comes down from God. This is our salvation. Now, the way Luther kind of frames it is the inner man, right? Paul does talk about the outer and the inner man, too. The inner man, or he can just talk about the soul, is that which receives passive righteousness. So according to the inner man, we are related to God, and we are related to God by way of passive righteousness. So I will say, so I'll put inner here, inner man. But then we've got active righteousness, which is our righteousness in the world. Here's our active righteousness in the world. And this is related, according to Luther, to our outer man, or our bodies. Outer/body. I'll say that. Here, the reason the third line exists is because this right here is civic righteousness, which is the idea that unbelievers have a kind of civic righteousness in the world that can do right things, even though they are not justified, they're not really related to God. So here essentially is the righteousness of the believer actively in the world, and then the unbeliever. That's why we have those 2 lines. And this one doesn't intersect with this because the unbeliever doesn't have the passive righteousness of faith. All right. So we have this inner man, the outer man. We have passive righteousness. We have active righteousness here. And the reason why it's important that Luther talks about the body in connection with active righteousness is this. Is that our body binds us to creation. Through our body, we are bound to this earth. My body is of the stuff of this earth. God took the dust and created me from the dust. And I cannot escape the body. My body is stuck here. And that's not a bad thing, that's a good thing. And so what we've often wanted to do is say salvation, the Christian life, Christians and non-Christian religions do this as well. We say the spiritual life is about escaping the body and dealing with the issues of the soul. But God has created us, again, it's not a dualism that there's one's good, one's bad. There are 2 essential aspects of our being. And these 2 essential aspects of our being, whether it's the soul and the body, mean that we relate to God and man. If we didn't have any relation to creation, if we didn't need to, God wouldn't have created us with bodies. He created us with bodies to tie us here to this earth so that we use those bodies in service of others. And so the body is to be used as the place of sanctification. God has given me hands and feet to work this earth, to take care of this earth, and to serve in the vocations that I've been given. That includes my relationship to other human creatures, to animals, to the land. All of this, because all of this goes back to creation. Now, God is in the business of restoring what we've messed up. And this is what redemption is all about. And so God restores our relationship to himself that we messed up through the fall by way of justification, the reception of passive righteousness, the passive righteousness of faith. Our relationship to God is restored because of Christ and his work. But God is also in the business of restoring these horizontal relationships. And so he's in the business of taking us who have broken all this stuff and fixing us, and fixing our relationships. And so through faith, then, we are granted new hearts, and we are put in right relation to one another. And so we are then to go back about that task of doing what God called Adam to do. Yeah, the curse is still there. We're always saint and sinner in this life. But he calls us back to that task that Adam had. This is a problem when you say that the cultural mandate, or as I call it, the vocation mandate, if you say that that's only for Adam, then we have this divorce between what Adam was doing and then what we're doing. But this is essentially what God has called us to do. And we see the same kind of language used throughout Scripture. As I mentioned before, in Genesis chapter 9, right after the flood occurs, God reiterates that mandate. Because this is kind of the new creation in some sense. Not the final new creation, but the whole earth has been kind of fixed. Sin has been wiped away. The whole earth has been changed. And think about flood. Flood is not just going to affect us, but it's going to affect creation. It's going to affect everything on the earth. And so this is kind of the first recreation of the earth in a sense. So that earth itself is affected and impacted and changed by this event. And so in a sense, man is starting over. Noah is like a new Adam. Not that he's in a state of sinlessness, but the whole human race now is going to come through the line of Noah. And so he is given that same mandate again. And I don't think it's a different mandate. But some of the Escondido theologians say that it's a totally different mandate. Now it's the Noahic mandate, not the mandate given to Adam. But he's really just reiterating the same mandate. He's saying, yes, this is still your role. And we can even go further into Adam's role, that he was supposed to name the animals as well. That's, again, another part of vocation that I didn't touch on, because that's not directly mentioned in that mandate, but it's mentioned in there. So Adam had responsibilities on this earth.
That's one thing you didn't touch on. Is
Go ahead.
Go up to the Noah thing. God got to the point where he was just going to wipe it all out and start over, too.
Yes. And we have a kind of... Yeah, it says that God is grieved, right, that he created man.
Grieved, man. It reads, it says, I will wipe mankind who I have created from the face of the earth, men and animals and creatures, and birds and everything.
And notice that he doesn't say he's going to destroy the land.
Right.
He's going to destroy man. Because we've corrupted God's creation.
So that's why I don't think God cursed the land at that point. He cursed man in his relationship to the land.
Yes. Yeah, and God's cursing of the land has more to do with man's relationship to the land. Because the land didn't do anything wrong, right? God created creation good. We've messed it up. We're the corruption that's on the land, so God wipes it away. And God renews and restores it, and then he renews and restores us as well. And so we have the man is bound to the ground, he's bound to the earth, he's created on this earth. And then, yes, go ahead.
That is a curse of the land, though, because the land doesn't have feelings, right?
Sure, yeah.
But the land's purpose is to serve man, and now the land is going to be frustrating man instead, and so it is a curse on the land. The land is not able to fulfill its purpose.
Yeah, and that's part of
the garden is not able to be gardened.
Yes, no, you're right. So that's part of the reversal of the roles again. The roles get all messed up so that we're not doing what we're called to do in the land. The land then doesn't have its proper place in the creation as God, as God has originally made it and intended it. And we need to speak eschatologically as well. Because God starts creating us in a land, And if you look at the end of the Bible, it goes back to the beginning. Creation is not here just for a while. And we could talk about things like the temporal kingdom, and we could think of, culture and these things as, in some sense, temporal. But we also have to remember that eschatologically, God's going to renew and restore the land too. The Bible ends the same way it begins. We have the tree of life in Revelation. We have the New Jerusalem. We have the rivers that are described in the book of Revelation. Man is placed back again in his proper place. Because man's proper place is not just in heaven, but man's proper place is for this earth. And God is going to then bring us back to the place that is like the garden. We're coming back to what is like the new Eden. The even greater Eden, the New Jerusalem. And we see these themes that are echoed not just in the beginning and the end, but throughout Scripture as well. So if you look at the place of the Israelites, well, what was the promise that God gave to Abraham? We think of the promise just of maybe salvation, because God promises to send forth the seed that is Christ. And we think of justification because he is declared righteous by faith, Genesis 15, and Paul cites this in Galatians and Romans 4. But there's more that's going on, too, in the story of Abraham. What are the promises that God gives to Abraham?
Land flowing with milk and honey.
Land. Yes, the land flowing with milk and honey. What else has he promised?
Descendants.
Descendants. What are those two related to? Think back to the mandate. God created Adam in the garden and said that he was to be fruitful and multiply. What? Descendants. And he was to take care of the land. In Israel, we see God reversing the curse and bringing man back into something like Eden. Imperfectly. We're still sinners. And the sin is eventually going to get them kicked out again. Just like Adam was kicked out of the land. But we see them brought into a land that is like Eden. Another thing that ties the land to Eden is... what was God doing in Eden?
Communing.
He was communing with man. His presence was there. Okay, God's presence was there. God's presence was in Israel. This was what made Israel special. Was they were in right relation to the land because they had a land flowing with milk and honey as man was supposed to. They were supposed to be in right relation to one another as guided by the laws. God gives them the Ten Commandments. And they were put in right relation to God because God is fellowshipping with them in the temple. Everything in Israel centers around the temple because that's the presence of God. So the presence of God in the temple echoes the presence of God walking in the garden. Another point of connection that we can make is the angel. Okay, think about this. We talked already about the angel. We have the angel with the flaming sword that says, what? You can't come back into Eden. You can't enter into God's presence. You've been kicked out. Your sin has kicked you out. You can't come back into the perfect land where you were created to be. Now, if you read the book of Joshua, the Israelites are coming to the nation of Israel, and upon getting there, what do they see? What do they see in the book of Joshua? There's an angel. There is an angel there. The angel with the flaming sword is there in Israel. He's on the border of the land of Canaan. And he lets them by. Okay, so we have the angel with the flaming sword who is standing there, and he is saying, I'm going to bring judgment if you come into the land. That's what the sword is for. I'm going to cut you, kill you. Well, someone was going to undergo that judgment. And it wasn't going to be Adam and Eve. This is what Christ did. Christ underwent the judgment that allowed us back into the garden, back into our fellowship with God. And we see a picture of that in Israel. Because Israel is a new Eden, not perfect, but a place where God's presence is. Because of what Christ would do, they are allowed back into God's presence in the temple, which is also finally a picture of what's going to happen one day when we are going to be restored in the land, the new and the greater Eden. Yes, go ahead.
What angel does Israel see before entering with Joshua?
With Joshua, yes.
I don't remember that.
Let me see if I can find the exact text. And I should have had the text outlined here before I went there. Okay. And I may have to get back to you afterwards because I don't know if I can get to this right here. If I can't find it right away, I will find it for you, and I will let you know. Yes, here it is, in the end of chapter 5. When Joshua, verse 13, when Joshua was by Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him. In his hand was his drawn sword. Joshua went to him and said, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" He said, "Neither, for I am the commander of the army of the Lord. Now I have come." Joshua fell with his face to the ground and worshipped. And he said, "What does my Lord wish to say to his servant?" And then he says, "The commander of the army of the Lord said to Joshua, 'Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy.'" So we have the drawn sword, we have the angel, and the connection with the holy place. Because the holy place is the plan where God's presence is. So that's the connection there.
Okay, so that's probably actually Christ, right? The angel of the Lord.
This here seems to be Christ, yes.
Because he doesn't tell him to get up. Instead, he gives him the line from the burning bush.
Yes, it does seem to be that this is the angel of the Lord that is Christ in this particular text. And that's the interpretation of the translators of the Bible I'm looking at, because the his is capitalized. So I would take that interpretation that this is Christ. I don't know that it's necessarily Christ that is holding the flaming sword, but we still have this connection that there is an angel, a messenger of God, that is guarding the holy place. And now they're allowed to enter into that holy place without being cut down. Okay. Any other questions here? Any other questions? Well, so we have this whole narrative about the landman's relationship to the earth. Our vocation is being tied to this earth, to the people around us, to the land, to the animals, which is our act of righteousness in this world. What does that tell us about our lives today? How do these truths relate to how we are to live? What does it mean for me living on this earth that God created me for this land and that he's going to renew this land? What does that mean for me? What do you think? I want to throw it out to you.
Well, first of all, just to back up a little bit,
Yeah, go ahead.
You talked about the flood, and then you said that God gave the mandate again, reiterated the
Yes.
mandate. So, likewise in our practical lives, we're baptized, and then I feel like we're given the mandate in the context of our baptism. I mean, if you kind of have a parallel between the washing from the flood, and then, okay, now serve the world, we can sort of make that parallel with our own lives, maybe.
Yes, you're taking the parallel that God first redeems, and then he gives the law.
That's true, so maybe that's out of... I mean, does that work?
No, I think you're right. God, when we're talking about active righteousness, it always flows out of passive righteousness. God always redeems and then gives us the law as a guide following that act of redemption. Now, the law also still then functions to show us our sin and bring us back to God's grace. But if we're talking about like the third use kind of sense of the law, that God does give it to us as a guide following redemption. And this is why, Adam is created by God's grace. Remember, we connected grace with creation. If that's true, the command that he's given, the cultural mandate then, is that is given as something to do for the world in response to God's grace. In that instance, it's the grace of creation itself. And then the third use of the law then, and David Scare makes this connection really well in a lot of his writings, is the third use of the law is essentially going back to the function that the law had for Adam, which is, it's a guide. In response to God's grace, he says, this is how you're to live, this is how I've created you. And so the third use of the law then is kind of us going back to that initial vocational mandate and living that out. Yes, I have another question here.
Well, since Angie backtracked us a little bit, I wondered if you could also address this relationship to the Escondido theology, because so far what you've described seems to give an individual mandate. But where do we get that corporate mandate for the church?
The corporate mandate for the church to serve in this world, you
right,
mean?
Exactly.
First of all, I think when we look at God's commands, we can never look at them just individualistically. I think we have that mindset as Americans because that's the way that we think, and we think individualistically. But God always gives his commandments to groups of people. Now, that doesn't mean every work of active righteousness you have to do is the corporate body of the church, because you all have unique vocations, and it's not like everyone in church has to go, work at Subway today and make sure everybody gets their food, right? As individuals, you do that, but that doesn't negate the fact that the church can also engage in those activities. God always speaks to groups of people when he's giving these commands. So we look at the vocational mandate then. We have Adam and Eve, and then we have Noah and his family. They're all given this mandate. The Ten Commandments are essentially this mandate, again, in more detail. It's more detail about how you live out this mandate, how you live out what God had told Adam. And again, we have this redemption. As you said, the redemption comes before giving then these rules for active righteousness, or these laws. So that's why we have the prologue to the Ten Commandments. God redeems them. He says, I have identified you as my own. I've redeemed you. And now I'm going to give you this mandate, which is how you are to live out in creation and in this world.
So you could look at Noah passing through the flood, then getting the mandate.
Mm-hmm.
The Israelites passing through the Red Sea and getting the Ten Commandments.
Yes.
All types of our baptism passing through the water.
Exactly. You're exactly right. So it's all pictures of our baptism, because that's where we receive grace. Then we are called out into the world to serve in the same way that he called Adam, following his act of creation, and Noah, following the flood, and then Moses and the Israelites following the crossing of the Red Sea. And with the Israelites, the Ten Commandments were given to what? The corporate people of Israel. They were called to be a light to the nations. God didn't say, be an individual light to the nations, each Israelite. But as a nation, they were to be the light to the nations. Now, Jesus uses that language to refer to us. We are lights, or salt of the earth. He uses these different analogies, but he goes back to the one of the light, that this is what God's people are. We can't do that if we are just individuals doing things out in the world. We do that as the corporate people of God. Now, sometimes that means, I go off and do things on my own, but that's not all it means, because we're always part of the church, just like the Israelites were always part of Israel. And we are a light to the people around us, and we can't be a light if we are just doing things as individuals and never functioning as the church at all, except to help our own. I think that's a huge problem.
Well, and I would argue that it's difficult to argue that any of this is supposed to exist on an individual level, because I think all the mandates reflect a communion, either with God or with other people. And so, you can, through the lens of our culture, think, okay, well, this is just for me, and I have to go serve this way. But in fact, all of the mandates God gives us have to do with other people. And so, right there, you're off and running in a community.
Yeah, our mandates do this an important thing, is that our bodies tie us to this earth, but our bodies tie us to other bodily people. I'm tied to speak and communicate with those who have bodies. I can't communicate with angels in the same way, and there's a reason. It's because those are the people I'm called to serve and work in community with. Yes?
So to fulfill the picture fully, and not as command, but they're baptized through the Red Sea, and then they receive, the bread from heaven, which sustains them, the water from the rock, which sustains them, as they're traveling through, as we heard, the city of Babylon, as they're in this wilderness or without God area. They're trusting Him, and then the Ten Commandments are given how they should live then among themselves, how to treat each other. Before the time, because Joshua, that's a picture of crossing the Jordan, as all the hymns.
Yeah, so we are, the time that we're in is analogous to the time of Israelites in the wilderness, in many ways. And that is that, yes, we are being fed, and we are being fed by the hidden presence of God, right? Because we don't see Him in Holy Communion and through the waters of baptism. But just like, they were fed by miraculous bread and miraculous water, that's what sustains us in the same way in this life of wandering. So yes, we're in a period that's like that. And so the entrance into the land then that Joshua has with the people into the land of Canaan is a picture of what is going to happen to us on the last day. So we are, in a sense, in the wandering period. And it's Peter who draws out a lot of this language in 1 Peter, that we are those who are wandering, or like those who are in exile. We are waiting the time when we are to receive the land. But I think you have to be careful with the implications drawn out of that, because the implications of some of the Escondido guys is, because this is our place, we're like those who are in Babylon. We've kind of got no hope of really doing anything because we're in Babylon. We just kind of got to live and do our thing. We can't really change who's ruling over us, like in Babylon. And I don't think that God expects us to then, and not that they would say they'd abandon culture, they certainly wouldn't say that, but to abandon culture as a church, or thinking that we can't have any impact on the culture at all. And I think we could just think, historically, the case is that Christians have had an effect on culture in a positive way. And Lutherans, in particular, if you think about what happened following the Protestant Reformation, the Lutheran Reformation most particularly. But I think there's implications we can draw out of this in terms of how we think about our place on this earth. And this is one of the problems with the kind of monastic ideal, was that if the monastic ideal, that is the ideal life, and if the ideal life is the way of contemplation, which was what the monastics largely taught, the via completiva, right? I'm probably not pronouncing that right, Eric, but
That's fine.
but the way of contemplation, and they said that is better than the via activa, the active life, is the contemplative life. Yes, so the ideal life is basically living in contemplation of God, but you're not emphasizing the bodiliness of creaturely existence and our relatedness to the earth that God has created us for. And so you're missing some of these things, I think, if you're not thinking about the important themes here, that we are created in and for this earth. So this has implications for then how we, treat creation, treat where we are. We need to see creation as a good place, a place where God has made us, and a place that ultimately God is going to redeem. So we have this connection between creation and redemption. So we can't, we speak of them separately because we speak of, the first and second article of the creed. We got creation and then redemption. And they're distinctive categories, but they're not separated. Because redemption includes creation. Because what does God use to redeem us? He uses creation to redeem us. Well, Jesus came into this earth as a man, part of creation, won salvation in a very physical way by getting, nails nailed into his skin and bones with blood. Okay, so God uses the physical stuff to save, and then that's applied to us through what? Creation. Where we have baptism, we have the Lord's Supper, we have pastors, people, flesh and blood people. So God uses all of this physical stuff, this created stuff, to bring about redemption. So we can't divorce creation and redemption, or creation and preservation. And we kind of know that from just the small catechism, as I said, because we have the kind of redemptive language with the act of creation itself. Whereas maybe someone in the Escondido school would say that these two things are totally divorced. Creation, preservation, and then redemption are kind of totally separate categories. And I don't think we can do that. And especially because we have to look at this creation as something that is ultimately going to be redeemed, and it's part of God's redemptive plan. And if that's the case, we are going to look at creation differently. We don't think you look at the earth differently if you think God is going to redeem this earth than if you think it's all just going to burn up and disappear. I mean, that will change the way that you think. And there has been some debate among Lutheran theologians in the scholastic era, the 17th century, which is largely what I know, over the nature of that recreation. There were some that would say that the language of fire that is used by Peter gives the implication that the earth itself is going to be totally destroyed, and God's going to make a totally new one, a new earth. I don't take that interpretation. I think that's problematic for a number of reasons. I think theologically, God basically doesn't ever do that. He doesn't destroy, but he renews. And the language of fire, yes, fire destroys, but what else does fire do? Purifies, right? So fire has the same aspects that water does too, because water is hugely destructive, and water also cleanses. So during the flood, we have the destructive aspect of it and the cleansing aspect of the water. And I think the fire is being used in the same way, that it's saying that, yeah, the wickedness is going to be burned off the earth, but it also will purify this earth. Yes?
What about where St. Peter talks about your faith, which is more precious than gold, although gold perishes?
Well, there's the question of what is the continuity, what is the exact realm of continuity between this earth and the renewed earth, which is a tough question. What's going to remain and what's not? So is gold going to remain in the same sense that it is? Or some people say, well, I think, the works of Mozart are going to endure because they're beautiful on the new earth. And Scripture doesn't give us that much information about exactly what that means. So I'm not going to say that every individual element of this earth is going to remain. But I think we're going to see continuity and discontinuity. We get a picture of this with the resurrection body. We see Christ in his resurrection body, and the resurrection body as described in 1 Corinthians 15. It is a renewal of the body, but it is a lot different. It's not a natural but a spiritual body. Right. We have all of this language of contrast and continuity. So in some ways it's the same, and in some ways it's very different.
But by analogy to the resurrection of the body, most people who will be resurrected on the last day, their bodies have in fact been completely destroyed, and yet there is continuity. So if the earth is completely burned up, that does not rule out continuity. It
will be the same earth, in some sense.
Yeah.
Right? Because when you're resurrected, you're not a different person.
Right.
Right? So it's not like you're a different person because you have a resurrected body. So there's the continuity and discontinuity. Like I said, I don't know exactly how that connects.
Yeah.
I don't think we're given enough information in Scripture for me to try to figure it out. And theologians do. They try to say, I think that this stuff is going to endure. This isn't. Like I said, you'll have the works of Mozart and Bach and all the musicians that I happen to like. I'm going to say are going to endure, right? And then the ones I don't like, they're going to.
The hard question.
Like we're not going to say Nickelback endures through the new heavens.
Mozart, Bach, and of course Bob Dylan.
But Eric was asking the question. The bodies, my great-great-grandfather's body is now decimated, gone. And in a new creation, here's a body, right?
But God can still take the scattered, ashes of somebody's body and stitch them back together. I mean, He can.
So the same thing then goes, He can burn up the earth and it can still come back.
Well, sure. And that could be the case. But I think that we have to say that it is the same earth. Just like the person is the same person.
So the ashes are brought back together in the same body?
Yes. I would say because it's the same. We have to have the identity of the same person. Because if you get rid of that, you don't have redemption at all. Redemption means that thing is actually restored.
So you'll definitely have beards.
Well, we know that. Yeah.
Clearly, you guys will have those beards.
I think women will have beards too.
We'll shave them just like we do now.
Oh boy. Yeah. Well, the only thing I know is that we have beards. I mean, come on. There's an ancient Jewish tradition that's found in the Talmud that says that when God blessed Abraham, He gave him a beard, and Abraham was the first man who ever had a beard. So the beard is the gift of God. Yeah.
And everyone else was like, "What is going on with your face?"
Yeah. Okay. Probably not true, but it's still a good tradition. I like it. All right, well, any final questions before we end here?
Maybe something not totally related, but reading through John Walton's Lost World of Genesis, he's got
Yes.
the Lost World of Adam and Eve, and obviously some of it's controversial, but I guess concerning Genesis, I don't know if you read the book or do you see?
I'm familiar with the book. I have not read it. I have a copy of it sitting on my shelf, but
I'm just curious if that would pose any problems with what we're talking about today. I haven't read the whole thing yet. I just read sections of it, so I don't know if you had, but if you did read it, perhaps.
Is that in terms of like an old Earth perspective and how that
No,
would affect?
it's where basically, in at least the Lost World of Genesis, the main premise is Genesis is not necessarily talking about God's initial creation ex nihilo. It's more of God creating order to things, and He uses not create out of nothing, but things were there already, and He creates order. That's kind of Walton's emphasis in the book, and challenging the traditional interpretation of Genesis, where this was the very beginning of things.
So is he denying the creation ex nihilo altogether?
No, he's not denying. He says in the book he doesn't deny it, but he denies. Well, at least he proposes that Genesis doesn't address that specific issue. Genesis more addresses creating order, out of things. So I don't know if that would...
Yeah, I haven't read the book, so I can't comment too much, but my brief thoughts on that, for whatever it's worth, would be that I do agree that Genesis 1 is largely, the purpose of it is largely to describe the orders of creation, as you're saying, and there's a theological purpose behind that. But I wouldn't say that fact negates the other stuff either being true. I do think that's the primary purpose. But I'm not an expert on that either, so don't take my word for much on that issue. So, but yeah, I definitely wouldn't say that I don't imagine that, and I don't know exactly what his perspective is, but that God did all this creation and created the earth later at some point, or...
Yeah, I didn't hear him address that specifically. He certainly believes God created ex nihilo, but that must have happened before he talks about creating the earth, in Genesis.
Okay. Yeah, like I said, I can't really comment because I'm not familiar with that text. Yes?
So what about the part of the creation that's not regenerated? So, you have all those that aren't regenerate. They're in physical bodies. And so eternally in physical bodies here on the earth? Or
No, they're not on the earth, but we're told they have physical bodies. And the other aspect of the Israelites entering into Canaan, we don't only have the Israelites getting the land and coming back to Eden. We also have the part of the story we don't like to talk about, which is that they killed all the Canaanites. They killed them all. Or the flood. God saved Noah and his family, but he killed a whole lot more people because he wiped sin out of the earth. What we have in the intrusion of the Israelites into the land that the Canaanites are already in is both the placing of God's people back into a land like Eden, but also the destruction of evil. And that's what God's going to do on the last day. As much as we don't like to talk about that, that's a reality. It's a reality in the text and in Scripture. But that eternal place for those who are not saved, we are told they have bodies. I mean, it's not a non-physical existence. That is not man's purpose, is to have... and obviously man's purpose is also not to be in hell. That's not man's created purpose either. We're not double predestinarians, so we wouldn't say that. It is a sad reality. But yeah, we wouldn't say it's a non-physical existence. Okay, this will be the final question, then we'll close here.
About the Walton question.
Yeah.
Usually it comes down to whether you see the first verse in the Bible as a summary of the rest of the next couple chapters, or the first thing that happens. In the beginning, God creates the heavens and the earth.
Yes.
Is that colon, I'm now going to tell you how he did it, or is that he just made raw material and now I'm going to tell you what he did with it?
Okay. Yeah, and I've heard that.
And since the second verse talks about waters existing,
and then he comes
point in the second direction a little.
And people talk about like the gap theory and stuff like that, and that's not an area that I am an expert in, honestly. So, my whatever commentary I would give you would probably be insufficient. So I'll save that for someone else.
I like to cite that bumper sticker I saw. In the beginning, God said, "Bang."
That's right. All right. Well, thank you. We will, we'll end here, and we have a break for a while. Our next talk. What time is the next talk at? I don't have the schedule in front of me.
4 o'clock.
4 o'clock. So we've got. What time is it now? It is. We've got about an hour. So, you want to go back to the hotel and take a 20-minute nap, or just hang out and talk, do whatever you want. See, some of you are kind of dozing off there. So, I know it's been a long day. All right. Thanks.